This is the story of an ancient world, a gigantic, complex living system which has contributed to the development of life on Earth since its distant origins, over 300 million years ago. And it is also the story of its inhabitants, diverse, fragile creatures, all the prototypes of evolution whose lives form an elaborate network of relations and dependencies. The protagonists of this story are giants 80 meters high and invisible microscopic organisms, individual creatures in complex societies, plants which imitate animals, and animals that look like plants. And every one is a vital element of the immense tropical jungle which gave birth to them. One of these creatures, the most intelligent and adaptable of all, spread far beyond the dense vegetation of the jungle. Thousands of years later, jungle and man met again, but the child prodigy had changed, and the jungle began to disappear. Only now are we beginning to understand the vital role the tropical jungle plays in the delicate balance of life. And in a race against time, scientists and naturalists from all over the world have taken up the fight to save this ecosystem. The future of all species will, to a large extent, depend on their success or failure. The Garden of Eden, the canvas of life, this earthly paradise, but also the green hell and the dwelling place of demons and savages. These words were used by the first Europeans to explore the jungle in search of the fountain of eternal youth, El Dorado, or the treasures spoken of in legends. They found nothing of all this. Only disease and death seemed to be awaiting man in the dark depths of the jungle. But there were treasures, even greater than any they had dreamt of, and in their ignorance they simply passed them by. Over half of all species in the world live within the jungle, and most of them remain to this day undiscovered by man. They have yet to reveal their secrets, the vital role they play in the balance of life, and perhaps the chemical compounds that could help us conquer some of the diseases that plague us. One reason for the tremendous biological variety of the jungles is simple: time. The rainforests now to be found in tropical regions have existed for tens of millions of years. Approximately 230 million years ago, when all land was a single enormous supercontinent, the climate was hot and damp, and jungle covered much of the Earth's surface. 70 million years later, with the breaking up of Pangaea, continental drift and the changes in climate, the jungles were reduced to the temperate zone between the two tropics. They were less extensive but still conserved the original species to which new ones were gradually added. Plants and animals which evolved to become more and more perfectly adapted to this environment. Some jungles, like this one in northeast Australia, are examples of how environmental stability made it possible for Mother Nature to experiment with new organisms capable of colonizing even the smallest, apparently inaccessible corners. The original species remained, but also new creatures, specialists in particular physical and environmental conditions, invaded every space, every nook and cranny of the humid interior of the tropical jungle. Here we find species such as the tree-like ferns, which came into being in the Carboniferous age over 300 million years ago. They share their environment with birds like the cassowary, which apparently first appeared just around 10,000 years ago. Life evolved, but the jungle is so rich that primitive early species were able to survive. But these primeval jungles were not just laboratories in which new forms of life were created and survived. Even more importantly, the jungle was home to those first plants, those simple one-celled organisms which made the air breathable long before any animal or plant arrived on Earth. Originally, our atmosphere contained almost no free oxygen. The land was then a place hostile to life, and living organisms were to be found only in the waters of the sea. There, a group of tiny one-celled algae acquired a powerful evolutionary weapon, the ability to obtain energy from the sun's radiation, freeing oxygen in the process. The acquisition of photosynthesis made possible the conquest of the land. From these algae, increasingly complex plants evolved, and the jungle began its invaluable task of oxygenizing our atmosphere. Since those distant days of the Paleozoic era, when the composition of the atmosphere became something very similar to that of today, the jungle has been and remains the catalyst of life. It cleaned the air, it was the permanent source of food, and it offered protection and refuge. Millions of living beings became part of its structure, and just a mere instant ago on the geological scale, man also found a home among the thick vegetation. The indigenous tribes that live in the tropical jungles base their survival on a profound knowledge of the environment which afforded them refuge and sustenance. Generation after generation, they learned the secrets of the jungle, the silent language of the plants and animals. Today, the peoples of the tropical rainforests are the guardians of increasingly valuable and increasingly threatened knowledge. A single Amazon tribe knows and uses over 100 plants for medicinal purposes. With them, they can reduce pain, cure, or prevent all types of illnesses and ailments. The jungle provides them with everything they need, and they have learned to take without damaging the environment. Century after century, they have handed down their knowledge by word of mouth from generation to generation, little suspecting that this chain of knowledge could be suddenly broken and disappear forever. The arrival in the jungle of supposedly civilized men has destroyed the natural balance achieved over millions of years. In their rush to obtain immediate profits, they are endangering the future of all the species of the earth, including us. The tropical jungles that existed at the start of the century are disappearing, and with them hundreds of species, many even before science has had a chance to discover them. During the past decade, the speed of the destruction has increased by 90% and continues to grow. Some countries decided it was vital to act fast if they wanted to avoid a tragic end, and began to fight to save their jungles. Costa Rica was one of the pioneers. But before they could save the jungle, fight to conserve it, they had to first find out how it works, all the organisms that go to make up this vast green world. For years now, scientists from all over the world have been at work in the jungles of Costa Rica, attempting to catalogue, understand and piece together each one of the different parts of this complex puzzle. Little by little, we are beginning to understand how the jungle as a whole works, a complex organism with many thousands of interactions among the living beings that form it and between these and their physical surroundings. Rather like a body composed of millions of individual cells, each one of which has a specific function, but which all work together. Each living being is like a single cell. Together they create numerous ecosystems, and these in turn make up the living, breathing organism that is the jungle. The jungle is the sum of its many different parts, each with its own natural laws. The head of this giant is the motor of the entire organism. Here, 40 meters above the ground, an immense canopy of green is fully exposed to the sun. The leaves absorb energy from the light and release enormous quantities of oxygen into the atmosphere, just as in the Paleozoic era, the one-celled algae did. This is the most important part of all. Only if a tree can find a space, only if its leaves can receive the light of the sun, will it be able to feed and so live. This ability to harness the energy from the sun is the key to everything. The top of the jungle is a world apart, in communication with the ground only through the trunks and the lianas. It is also a place where food is everywhere, in the form of leaves and fruits, full of the energy the trees have taken from the sun. It is therefore a world which offers safety and sustenance, and many species have taken advantage of this. These are howler monkeys. In order to reach the Shangri-La up on high, you need to be an expert climber or to be able to fly. So the canopy of the jungle is inhabited mainly by insects, monkeys and birds. For many of the inhabitants, this canopy offers so many advantages that they never go down to the ground. Many others, like these monkeys, only do so in order to drink. As a result, many of the species of the jungle remain unknown to science. Because scientists first came here less than 20 years ago, and when they did, armed with harnesses and safety ropes, they were very limited in their movements. The energy is transferred from the sunlight into the plants and from the plants to the animals, making the canopy of the jungle the first step in the cycle of energy and matter. But the leaves are not easy to digest. A large stomach is necessary in which to hold the cellulose while it decomposes, and this means digestion is long and heavy. If they had to contend with many enemies, this would be a serious problem for the monkeys and other mammals that live in the treetops. But the only danger this high up are the giant South American eagles, and the monkeys can digest their food in peace. This safety, which allows the monkeys to digest their food undisturbed, also permits the birds to hatch and raise their young. This pair of red macaws is, as every year, making preparations for reproduction. Like the majority of parrots, the couple remains together for life, and once a year, they breed among the highest branches of the trees of the jungle. Conditions up here also mean that animals, even species as different as the monkeys and the parrots, have in some respects evolved similar tactics. Macaws are extremely intelligent, with a wide repertoire of sounds and very skilled with their feet and beaks. In order to develop these complex abilities, the macaws, like the monkeys, need more time in which to learn. This means greater dependence on the parents, and so greater vulnerability to possible enemies. But up here in the hollow of a 30-meter cyber tree, the young macaws can take their time. Lower down in the shadow of the canopy of leaves, the jungle is an entirely different world. This intermediate region between the head and the foot of the jungle, the treetops and the ground, is a kingdom of light and shade dominated by the trunks of the enormous trees of the jungle. This layer of the jungle is where the opportunists live. In the brutal competition for light below the canopy, the majority of plants struggle to stretch upwards or to find a space where light penetrates. But in the competition for light, the big trees won out, leaving no room for the smaller plants. So some simply took another route and became epiphytes. That is, they attached themselves to another plant, in this case the trunks of the giant trees. Ferns, mosses, orchids and bromeliads like this one were successful. Their roots attach themselves to the tree trunks, and so they are able to absorb light and nutrients, while the humidity of the jungle atmosphere means that there is always water. In this intermediate world, there are fewer animals because conditions are tougher than in the treetops, and greater efforts are required in order to adapt. Using its curved claws to hang on, the three-fingered sloth is showing its young how to eat. Once they are weaned, their diet is entirely vegetable, especially the leaves and fruits of this tree, a cecropia. The sloth acts as a platform to protect her young. In this world, without the hiding place of the thick vegetation of the canopy, the animals are more vulnerable to predators, and as a result, in this intermediate layer of the jungle, camouflage is a frequent means of defense. So at first sight, it would seem that the only life is plant life. But if we look a little more closely, we will discover many fascinating ways of remaining unnoticed. An insect that looks like a stick. A thorn with wings, and its young. A leaf, eating another leaf. All means are valid if the end result is survival. The sloth also has a way of camouflaging itself. Below the scales that cover the surface hairs live microscopic algae of a greeny-blue color, which means its body merges into the background of the jungle. To complete its disguise, the sloth moves incredibly slowly, hence its name. But this, which might seem to be a handicap, means that even when it moves, it is very difficult to detect. Below this intermediate layer, the jungle changes completely. Progressively, as we leave behind the canopy with its dense vegetation, light becomes increasingly scarce. The fight for the last few rays of sun that make life possible becomes desperate, and leaves, stalks and tendrils stretch upwards like explorers searching for the few patches of light that will enable them to grow up towards sunnier climes. Finally, on the ground, the darkness is almost total. The floor of the jungle is a world of permanent shadow. A blanket of dead leaves covers this silent, apparently lifeless world. But among the shadows, thousands of hidden creatures play their role in the drama of life and death. Here, almost all the available energy is obtained by hunting. All the animals are constantly on the alert. The slightest movement can create panic. This is the part of the jungle with least life. All food here comes from the upper layers, either in the form of leaves or fruits, or in the form of the animals that come down to drink. Except for these small invertebrates that live on the dead leaves and trunks, resources are scarce here on the floor of the jungle. So contrary to popular belief, which imagines the jungle to be full of large mammals prowling around among the dense vegetation, the ground is the poorest part of the jungle, the place where food is most difficult to find. A young boa is out hunting. The adults lie in wait for their prey, camouflaged among the branches of the trees. But this inexpert beginner is hoping to find some small mammal among the bed of leaves, and his movements create panic among the monkeys and birds higher up. The warning cries of the monkeys alert the entire jungle, but luck seems to be with the boa. A dead squirrel is better than he dared hope for. Once the snake has got his food, the jungle returns to normal. An animal this size will take the young boa several weeks to digest, during which he will pose no threat. But before the snake can digest its prey, it has first to swallow it. The ability to dislocate their jawbones means that boas and pythons can swallow large animals. The constricting rings, which it uses to strangle its prey, now serve as protection. On the ground, immobile while it is swallowing the squirrel, the young snake is very vulnerable, and the head is its weakest part. So it protects it with the strong musculature of its body, while it slowly absorbs its prey. The tropical jungle breathes. Every day, along with the oxygen released from the leaves, the jungle also exhales water, returning to the atmosphere more than half of all it receives in the form of the heavy tropical rains. The torrential rainfall, which without the protective covering of the trees would wash away the soil, pours down onto the treetops and then gently drips down into the interior of the jungle. There it waters the soil and much of it is absorbed by the plants. The trunks carry it back up to the canopy of the jungle, and there it evaporates, so returning to the atmosphere. In this way, the jungle is an important regulator of the climate. The water saturates the soil, the vegetation and the air. Inside the jungle, humidity is so high that some aquatic plants are able to live far from rivers or lakes. The poison arrow frogs or dart frogs live close by the bromeliads. The humidity of the atmosphere keeps their delicate amphibian skins wet, but they need these plants as a nursery for their tadpoles. The bromeliads form small pools at the base of their leaves. A large leaf can hold up to 4 liters of water in its center. There, an enormous number of tiny invertebrates live, so these pools are also a source of food. Here, the dart frogs leave their young until they metamorphose into young frogs. Because the plants are so important for their tadpoles, the poison arrow frogs jealously guard those in their territory. Their intense colors are a sign not to come near. All the dart frogs are very brightly colored. These colors, which in the middle layer of the jungle are usually for camouflage, here become a warning to any animal that may be tempted to eat them. The skin of the dart frog secretes one of the most powerful poisons in the world, potent toxins which some indigenous tribes use to smear the tips of their darts and arrows. Hence the generic name for all these different species of frogs. Associations between different species are very frequent in the jungle. Just as the frogs need the bromeliads, the acacias of Costa Rica have small allies which help them survive in this world where competition is fierce. In this case, both sides benefit from the collaboration. The powerful thorns of this acacia are a much more sophisticated weapon than they at first appear. They not only dissuade the large herbivores from eating the leaves, but also defend the tree from other tiny but dangerous enemies. These are sap-sucking bugs. When they discover a tender shoot, they collect on it, feeding on the sap and weakening it until it dies. But when one of these bugs descends on a Costa Rican acacia, a powerful army of ants suddenly appears from nowhere, swarming around the bug. There is no hiding place on the acacia. The bug will be mercilessly persecuted until the acid and the bites of the ants force it to leave and look for a less dangerous tree. Any plant or animal that attempts to invade the tree they protect will be mercilessly attacked by the pseudo-Myrmex ants. Of course, the tree has to pay a price for the services of this formidable army. In exchange, the acacia offers the ants a home and food. The thick thorns are swollen and so become practical shelters where the pseudo-Myrmex ants lay their eggs. Also, at the base of its leaves, the acacia produces tiny spheres full of sugars which serve as food and provide energy for the efficient soldiers. Thus, the ants never need to leave the tree and can remain constantly on guard. Down in the depths of the forest there is very little wind and, as we have seen, fierce competition for any patch of sunlight. With no wind to help them and with land at such a premium, the plants of the forest have had to invent all kinds of tricks in order to be able to reproduce and ensure their descendants will have at least a chance to grow. And once more, plants and animals work together. Brightly colored flowers are one of the most popular methods. Red is the favorite color because it stands out most intensely against the green background. Thus, the flowers become highly visible advertising signs indicating that here there is free food for anyone who wants to take it, and many animals do. The South American hummingbirds are the most efficient pollinators of flowering plants. As they suck the nectar from the flower, the beak and head become impregnated with pollen, and when they move on to another plant to repeat the process, they pollinate it. In order to do this, the hummingbirds have had to evolve into some of the most expert flyers in the world. They can remain suspended in the air, fly forward at over 40 kilometers an hour, and, most difficult of all, fly backwards. For the plants it visits, the more the hummingbird repeats the process, the better. So some plants, like the heliconia, produce rows of flowers which mature progressively. These flowers produce just a few drops of nectar each time, which means the hummingbird must feed from a number of heliconias in the same area one after another. Beating its wings up to 80 times a second, the hummingbirds can suck the nectar from flowers without stopping for 4 hours at a time. In other words, they can beat their wings around 1,000,000 times without a rest. Every minute, their heart beats 1,000 times, and their lungs breathe 250 times. This requires an enormous amount of energy. In fact, they use up more energy in relation to their size than any other warm-blooded animal. And so they need to ingest nectar equivalent to half their body weight every day, for which the heliconias are very grateful. With the problem of pollination solved, the plants face the second obstacle the jungle places in the way of reproduction. With no wind to carry the seeds, the trees need an ally to help disseminate them. Otherwise, they would stand no chance of growing in the shadow cast by the parent tree. And fruits provide the answer to this tricky problem. The seed is surrounded by succulent, fleshy fruit. The basic strategy is the same as the acacia and the ants, or the flowers and the hummingbirds, energy-giving food in exchange for favors. For the animals that flourish on the dark, dense forest floor, this is manna from heaven. Some of them eat the entire fruit and then excrete the seeds a long way from where they found them. Or, like the squirrels or the agoutis, they eat both fruit and seed, but any they can't eat immediately they bury, and, as they have bad memories, some are not only forgotten, but have been planted ready to grow. Food for the majority of animals of the forest floor comes from above. This may be the seeds, with their wrapping of energy-rich, fleshy fruits, or the dead bodies of the animals that live out their lives in the treetops. And that would seem to be the end of the story. But in fact, it represents just a tiny part of the matter process down here on the forest floor. The immense majority of the transformation of matter is carried out by a multitude of tiny creatures, insects, funguses and bacteria that live hidden among the carpet of leaves, carrying out their invisible work. And even here, there are associations between different species. An ant procession forms a line of moving leaves across the jungle. The leafcutter ants of the Atta species are the tireless gardeners of the jungle of Costa Rica. The work of these little insects is never ending. They search for green leaves close to the ground or which have fallen from above and transport them to their underground nests. The ants are very small and the leaves of the jungle are in general very big, but these tireless workers are a veritable army trained to demolish. Using their legs as compasses and their strong jawbones as scissors, the Atta ants cut the leaves up into sections which can be more easily transported. In just a few minutes, one of the enormous leaves of the jungle has been reduced to fragments just a few centimeters across. For kilometers, the ants follow the trail marked from the nest, each one carrying his piece of leaf. And they never even eat the tiniest bit of these fragments. For paradoxically, the leafcutter ants are unable to digest cellulose. And in the jungle, whenever one animal cannot carry out a task, he looks for an ally. In the nest below ground, the ants chew up the leaves they have cut, making a pulp to which they add the spores of a fungus. The fungus extracts the nutrients from this pulp, and the ants then eat the fungus. The soils of the tropical jungles are very poor in nutrients. All the plants that grow in this soil spread their roots close to the surface and take the substances they need directly from decomposing organisms before they have been able to filter down to lower levels. The ends of these fine surface roots emerge from the soil, attach themselves to the fallen leaves, and with the aid of another microscopic fungus, absorb the phosphorus, minerals, and other nutrients. Because their roots are close to the surface, the giants of the jungle, trees which can rise to over 70 meters high, need to form buttresses at the base in order to ensure stability. In the forests of dry regions, the roots burrow deep down into the soil to find water, but here enormous roots emerge from the surface, growing back up against the trunk of the tree to hold it steady. This is yet another paradox of the jungle. These are the most impressive trees with dense foliage and the largest, thickest roots, which nonetheless only demonstrate how poor and fragile the soil of the jungle is. Unfortunately, not everyone understands this. Believing that the soil which could support such dense forest must be excellent for crops, men have burnt and cleared the jungle, only to find that after 2 crops, the soil is sterile. Without trees, the water carries the soil away, and what had been a paradise of biodiversity becomes arid land. But the soil of the jungle, which proved to be useless for crops, is nonetheless excellent as pasture. Clearing and burning opened the jungle for intense cattle rearing, which in turn speeded up the process of deforestation. In just one decade, the 1990s, 2 million hectares have been lost, an area the size of Mexico. Faced with this situation, countries have begun to protect their jungles, and once again Costa Rica was a pioneer and an example for the rest of the world. Exactly 29 years ago, the National Park Service was set up, and we began to create the first national parks in Costa Rica. We literally started from nothing. At that time, we had no funds, no staff, and no support for conservation measures, because people did not believe that the jungles could be wiped out. They thought there was still time, and we're talking about 29 years ago. 29 years of work have produced results. The efforts of the Costa Rican government to plan for the future have meant that the country has conserved much of its jungle. And this is jungle of the most diverse, rarest types. Dry tropical jungle, rainforest, mangrove forest. Today, over 12% of the country is national park or reserve, while in the world as a whole, only 8% of jungle is protected. Costa Rica began to take action before the problem reached today's crisis levels, and in this provided an example for others to follow. Because here, thanks to years of research in the field, conservation measures have been introduced even before problems arose. And this has been achieved because they understood that in the jungle no species is dispensable. In the cloudy forest of Monteverde in the northwest of the country, we find one of the most emblematic and rarest birds in Central America. The quetzal, the sacred bird of the Mayas and the Aztecs, still has a stable population in Costa Rica. In order to live, it requires the critical conditions which are found in the cloudy jungle: extreme humidity, low temperatures, a very dense lower layer of vegetation. The protection of its ecosystem, of all the living beings that form part of it, is enough to ensure its future. But what is true of the quetzal cannot be applied to many other species, which depend not only on their direct habitat, but also on the entire system of different jungles within a country, or even in distant countries. Each day we learn more about the tropical species which emigrate to lower or higher ground, to wetlands or lagoons, or any of the other hundreds of places which are ideal for reproduction. It's very common for species to move, and when you create a national park in isolation, surrounded by crops or pasture, you prevent species from migrating, and this means these species start to die out, because they are unable to follow their normal patterns. The struggle to conserve the tropical jungle is a race against time. Every year, around 14 million hectares are destroyed, an area a quarter the size of Spain, and 3 times bigger than Costa Rica. The pace of clearing and burning easily outstrips the speed with which protected areas are being created, and the jungle is inexorably disappearing. But not all hope is lost. Destruction and conservation are extremes which have one thing in common: money. The jungle is destroyed in the search for quick profits, and is conserved if it generates profits equal to or greater than those obtained from destruction. This is no easy task, because maintaining natural parks and protected areas not only does not produce profits, but involves considerable costs. Fire prevention teams are training volunteers in the Guanacaste National Park. This is just one of the conservation tasks which needs specialized trained people, and this costs a lot of money. But the park itself can, in the long term, and with the right attitude, provide many sources of income. Again, the Costa Rican National Park Service has been a pioneer. The costs are truly enormous. The state simply does not have enough to adequately develop the protected areas. So we need to find our own sources of funding. Fortunately, this is possible. I am thinking, for example, of providing greater services to the public in protected areas. I am thinking of debt exchanges, of transforming Costa Rica's debts with other countries, above all the United States, into conservation funds, internal funds. I am thinking of the sale of the carbon stored in our jungles, what is now called joint implementation, and I'm thinking of charging for what we call environmental services, water. Our forests, especially those of the mountains, hold vast resources of clean, high-quality water. But this water has no value. What we pay now is the cost of distribution and administration. But a cubic meter of water is itself worth nothing, and that's a mistake, because we need someone to protect those water systems, restore them. So we are developing a system, an innovative system, whereby the user is charged, whether it be a factory, or a town council, or hydroelectric dam. Charge them for this water and pay the owner. This is the only way to stop the deforestation of the tropical jungles. Because if the owner sees that his land is valuable because he is being paid to conserve it, and because it produces water, then that forest has a high value, and the owner will not cut it down, turn it over to pasture or rice crops or whatever else. Between 70 and 90% of all the creatures of the world live in the tropical jungles. The disappearance of just one species closes the door on the possibility of finding medicines and remedies for the diseases that afflict humanity. It has been calculated that 70% of the world's population depends on traditional medicines obtained from the jungle to cure their illnesses. In Kenya and Tanzania, 40% of natural medicines come from the trees and animals of the jungles. In Asia, 90% of the traditional pharmacopoeia is based on vegetable products, and the Chinese alone use over 5,000 species of plant for medicinal purposes. In the Amazon, where forest fires are so numerous that in photographs taken at night from satellites they look like cities, the indigenous population knows the healing properties of over 1,000 vegetable species. Even the most technologically advanced medicine obtains from plants important drugs like quinine used to fight malaria, or drugs to lower blood pressure, and chemical compounds used to combat some mental illnesses, and even AIDS. The jungle is now closer, more accessible for all of us. Tourists can easily gain access to places which only 10 years ago were the sole reserve of untamed nature. And that is part of the solution that is being put into practice to save this colossal benefactor. Ecotourism and the pharmaceutical potential of the tropical jungle have become important alternatives to cutting and burning. But while one part of the world fights to make us understand the importance of the jungle, millions of hectares of virgin forest are now disappearing, taking with them hundreds of species we do not even know. We are starting to realize that the interaction among all these organisms is so complex that even the smallest may turn out to be of vital importance for the functioning of the whole. Without bromeliads, there would be no dart frogs. Without hummingbirds to pollinate them, many flowering plants would disappear. Without the invisible funguses of the forest floor, the trees would not obtain many of their nutrients. And without the jungle, the climate of the entire planet would be affected to extremes, which could endanger our very existence. It is said that the death of an indigenous shaman is like destroying an entire library of irreplaceable volumes on the medicinal possibilities of the plants and animals of the jungle. Today, at the beginning of the 21st century, we should ask ourselves whether we are destroying the foundations of the library which holds the secret of life on Earth.